Good morning. I have a helper this morning. I'll show you this helper. You want to wave and say hello? I've asked her to be very quiet, but she's reading. Here we are. As I said yesterday, it's been a hectic week, and there are a lot of people for whom we're praying. And those include my daughter Kimberly and her mother Tommy. And Tommy's going to have surgery in the morning, a spinal fusion. She's very anxious about it. We want to pray for her to be calm and to trust and to know that the Lord's with her. Continue to pray for Kimberly. She's at home and she's doing well, has another doctor's appointment this week, but she's trying to catch up with all of her other activities. So pray for her. Pray for my friend who's just gone into hospice. We've been praying for her for many months, and I want to continue to pray for her and pray that the Lord gives her peace in these moments, and also peace for her family who loves her very much. There are a number in our church. We continue to pray for you. We always pray for each of you, day in, day out. Some with special difficulties, and some recuperating, some working hard at it, and we just continue to remember you as you remember us. Thank you so much for the outpouring of responses during this last week. Interestingly, we are going to embark on a little study in the book of Philippians. I find it an intriguing book. It's one of my very favorites. I've always told my students most of my favorite books. You put aside the Brothers Karamazov and the Count of Monte Cristo. Most of my favorite books are shorter books. Maybe that's why I like Philippians so much. It's very short. You could read it every day. It wouldn't hurt at all. You'd probably like it a lot. There are a lot of familiar passages there. Not a whole lot of organization to it, but it's fascinating, and we're going to look at it for the next several weeks. In 1964, I guess it was early fall of 1964, I began a year-long stint at the Woodland Baptist Church in Houston. It's located just a few miles from Reagan High School, which was the name of my high school when I went there. It's been changed to Heights High School because John Reagan was evidently part of the Confederacy. I don't know, he's Postmaster General or something of the Confederacy. I never did know anything about John Reagan when I was there, so I don't miss him. I did know about Heights Boulevard and about the Heights, and so I don't mind that it's now Heights High School. That's neither here nor there, is it? But the church was located just a few miles from there, and I had been graduated from that high school about 5 years prior. My first Sunday there, the church had a welcoming celebration of sorts down in the big old fellowship hall, and I stood in a receiving line to shake the hands of what seemed like about 10,000 people. It was a long receiving line. There were a lot of people, and I'm sure I shook a lot of hands, and I didn't have the same kind of queasiness shaking hands that I developed later in life. At any rate, there's one person who stood out. I remember so little about that time at Woodland, but I remember my little bitty office, and I remember the names of about 2 or 3 people. Isn't that something? It's almost a lost year. But I do remember one fella. I don't remember his name. I don't remember his face. I wouldn't know him if I saw him, but then, of course, that's been a long time ago. Wouldn't know his name if I heard his name, but I do remember what he said to me. As he came through that line, he had a very somber look, stern, looked me in the eye. He said, I am Mushface Smith, and I am the chiefest of sinners. I got the impression that, number one, he did not consider himself the chiefest of sinners. He just thought that sounded good. And I thought maybe the long face was for show. I don't know. I guess that sort of thing's been happening as long as any kind of religion has existed. If there, and in fact, any kind of rule or system of government, that kind of thing has always existed. But I think it's sad to see it in a Christian. I see a Christian person seemingly so oppressively solemn and gloomy, and he seemed to be that way. Turned out, during the time I was there, he was that way. He was always, he was never going to smile. He wasn't going to laugh. It felt like to me that he was carrying some huge weight on his shoulders. You know, Jesus had a word for those that he called hypocrites, play actors. He used them as a negative example. He says, this is what you do not want to do. This is in the Sermon on the Mount, 6th chapter of Matthew. He said this, when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. When you fast, you know what he meant. They have received their reward. People saw them. And that's really what they were looking for, wasn't it? Dressing up, putting on makeup to look pale and wan. They wanted people to see them and say, oh, look, he's fasting. Isn't that wonderful? It was part of their being. But he says, truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. Get down, darling. You can't sit up here on my lap right now, but in a few minutes. Well, I told you it could happen, didn't I? Yeah, right. That your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Well, Philippi was an ancient city in Macedonia. It's northwestern Greece. In fact, if you look at a map of Greece and of Turkey, you will see that that northwestern Greece extends across the sea, and the northern part of the sea, and Philippi was up there. That Thessalonica was also, Berea was also up in that area, but I looked for a good map, but I couldn't really find a good, effective one in the time that I spent looking, and so you just have to kind of follow my directions there. It was named for Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. Now, this town, it was never a huge city. It was never a big metropolitan area. It was never a part of the trade routes. And so it was not a terribly large town, and it was not extremely famous until 42 BC, when the Roman forces of Mark Antony and Octavian avenged the murder of Julius Caesar by defeating Brutus and Cassius there at Philippi. When Octavian became the first emperor of Rome about 15 years later, he rebuilt the city of Philippi, made it a military outpost called a colony, and a colony had various accoutrements that went with being a military outpost. A lot of importance attached there. The Roman Empire was initiated in 27 BC, so this moment in Philippi in 42 BC is sometimes considered the beginning of the Roman Empire. Octavian at that point initiated the Pax Romana, which for 200 years there was no huge war. It was mostly relatively peaceful all through the world. That was an important thing for Christianity. The Pax Romana, because the fact that the world was at peace and not at war meant that the laws were enforced, and that it was easier to travel because you didn't have to worry about getting caught up in one of those wars that they constantly were fighting for about 300 or 400 years prior to that. So, about 80 years after the establishment of the Roman Empire, Paul had a vision. He was in Troas, which is in what is now Turkey, the western part of Asia Minor, and he had a vision, and the vision was of a man who said, "Come over and help us in Macedonia. Come to Macedonia, help us." And he believed that God had dissuaded him from going in one direction and was calling him to go to Europe. And so he went to Philippi, and he made his acquaintance with Europe in that town of Philippi. Maybe this is a reason that he had such affection for the Philippian church, or maybe it was one of the reasons that it was his first. The church from the very beginning of the ministry in Europe had helped him in many, many ways, not the least of which was financially. Paul normally did not accept financial help in the churches, but this particular church sent him financial means when he needed it, and also was very generous in the offering that he was taking for the Jerusalem church. So these people had been very kind to him, and he really, really appreciated them. So we have this relationship which exists between Paul and the Philippians. Fourth chapter. In the fourth chapter, Paul says, "You Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again." The first European convert was in Philippi. It's a woman named Lydia. There's some suggestion that her name was something else and may have been mentioned at certain times in this letter or in the book of Acts. but we don't know her real name. That's some conjecture, because she was from the region of Lydia, which is the western part of what is now Turkey. That was the region from which she came, the Lydian woman, and probably known as Lydia to all of those who traded with her. She was a businesswoman, a evidently highly successful businesswoman from Thyatira, which is in Asia Minor, the western part in the province of Lydia. And she came over there, and she was in Philippi, and that's where she was conducting her business. She was a Gentile woman, and she was the first convert in Europe. She was a dealer in purple cloth. Well, after her baptism, she and her household were all baptized. She opened her home to the missionaries. She prevailed upon them. This is Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke. All of them were there. And she prevailed upon them to stay in her home, and they evidently stayed for a good while. The reason that people say they stayed for a long time, several weeks, perhaps months, was because the church was such a strong church from the very outset. It never weakened. It just continued to grow. And Paul returned there about 5 years later, and again a year after that, and stayed for a good while either time. And so the concept, the idea is that he stayed there for a long, long time because he was so closely connected to these people. It was a strong church, and they had a long-standing relationship. It came to an abrupt end this time. You know the story. A slave girl followed them around. I don't know what she was doing. I don't think that Luke really tells us, except that she was following them around. Maybe she had become enamored of the message. Something about Paul had made her want to follow, and she would say, these men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation. She kept doing this day after day after day, and she annoyed Paul. For some reason, it was annoying to him, perhaps because she was being sarcastic, maybe. She was a girl who was especially talented as a medium or a fortune teller, a psychic, perhaps. She was very popular as a psychic. And people would come to her, and she was a slave, so her owners were making a lot of money off of her. So Paul became annoyed. He turned and he said to the Spirit in this girl, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And it came out of her that very hour. That's the way that Luke writes that in the 16th chapter of Acts. Now you know what happened. You know what happened next. There was a public accusation. These owners went to the magistrates. They went to the city square. They said, these men are teaching a religion that is not lawful, and they have done something here because, you know why? Because she no longer had this whatever power it was that she had had before. So the hope of their gain was gone, and they made this public accusation that Paul and Silas were preaching a religion that was not lawful. Now, this wasn't true, but didn't really make any difference. I see a magistrate here who's not very strong. This is a magistrate who is not quite sure what is going on, but he's not going to investigate much. He takes them, he has them flogged and chained up in a dungeon in the prison or in the jail in Philippi. So, a night in jail for them became a time for some old-fashioned gospel singing. I don't know what they sang. Nothing that we know, because they didn't have the same hymns we do. But we have hymns that we love. And if we were in a place like that, maybe we would feel like singing. Maybe we wouldn't feel like singing. But maybe if we did, we'd sing something like, "Since Jesus Came Into My Heart." Maybe we'd sing something like "Victory in Jesus." Maybe we'd sing some rousing songs, and maybe we'd sing some soft songs. But we'd find something, wouldn't we? Yeah. Well, we just have to let Jim lead us in that. Jim, would you lead us in some songs if we're down in prison? Well, that's what Paul and Silas did. They sang songs. They sang hymns. Well, we know the story. An earthquake, a saved jailer, once again, a fearful magistrate. You know why? You know why Paul and Silas were released? Not because of the earthquake, not because everyone was convinced that Jesus was Lord. They were released because this magistrate realized that he had flogged Roman citizens. That's against the law. He could have himself been strung up. He wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible, so that's what you had. Very abruptly, in one day, they were gone. They did come back 5 years later, I mentioned, for evidently an extended period of time. There are some folks that believe he wrote 2 Corinthians during that time, or a large part of it while he was there. Came back through a year later after an incident in Jerusalem, and this church had grown. They had followed his ministry eagerly, and so he starts his letter by expressing his gratitude to them and for them. And for the first time, he uses a word that stands out as the keynote of the letter. You're going to have to leave that alone for a minute, or you're going to have to leave the room. Both Kimberly and David, on rare occasion, talked during church. And I have to remember that she's 4. And she's so adorable. Well, Paul begins his letter by expressing his gratitude to them and for them. And for the first time, he uses the word which stands out as the keynote of the letter. And the word is joy. Joy. Joy or rejoice is used more times in this 4-chapter letter, this short letter, more times in this short letter than all of the rest of Paul's letters combined. And the most intriguing thing about it is that he was in prison at the time that he wrote it. His imprisonment was probably in that squalid little Mamertine prison. It's in the shadow of the Curia, which was the seat of government of the Roman government in Rome. in these circumstances, in prison, and listen, that's not a comfortable cell. It's a squalid little, dark little place. Most of it underground at this point. Not only that, but he believed that it was possible that this was the end of his life. He thought there was a possibility he would be convicted and executed. And in these circumstances, he writes about the joy of the Christian. The joy of the Christian. That doesn't necessarily mean the comfort of the Christian, does it? But we can take comfort in the joy. That's not even the peace of the Christian, but we can take comfort in the peace, and we can be joyful in God's peace. Ernest Scott has written in his introduction to the Interpreter's Bible, Introduction to Philippians in the Interpreter's Bible. There it is. It is the background of tragedy that gives significance to his use of the word. And I truly believe that it is that background of tragedy that makes me attracted to the book. In earlier letters, particularly Galatians and Romans, Paul sets out his apology, his defense for the gospel message. Here there's no argumentation at all. He has a solidified theology. He has come to grips. He has answered the questions that he might have had in his mind, as many of us have questions from time to time. He has answered those questions, and he only says one thing in the entire letter. In the 3rd chapter, he writes, "Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which comes through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God that depends on faith." Why? Why the joy? Where does it come from? How is it possible? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today and for the next few weeks. I'm going to say one more thing. Number one, I think he had joy because of their kindness to him. That's what the text tells us. "I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you, making my prayer with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ." He says later in the passage, "It is my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent, and so may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ." For sure, trouble comes. Trouble with a capital T. Disappointment comes. Anxiety comes. But remember the words of the psalmist. "Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning." I'll see you next time.